Attention crew, this is your Captain Caliban speaking. This is a supplemental episode of Enterprising Individuals, where we bring you news and tidbits from the world of Trek, also interviews with special guests, and a few little surprises along the way. It's good to be back at it, back on the Trek. I was representing Enterprising Individuals and the Just Enough Trope Network at the Convergence Convention 2 weekends ago, and I had a great time there and had a lot of fun conversations about pop culture and sci-fi topics. And we recorded our annual live show there. This year we tackled Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and examined if it's really as bad as everyone says that it is. I won't spoil what we decided, but if you want to listen to that live show recorded at Convergence, I'll be posting it on our Patreon at patreon.com/EISTpod in its entirety. I'll also be sharing the live stream of the panel that was streamed from the con, which has audio and video from the event. So expect to see that on our social media in a few days. Check it out. Today on the show, I'm talking with Connor Speak. Connor is a former guest of the podcast, along with Alexa, as the co-hosts of Boldly Boinking, but he's back with a new podcast and a new project called Rocketman Explores, where he and a series of guests examine a particular topic in speculative fiction by looking at different entries in various franchises. And if that makes it seem too dry, let's just say he's talking about Star Trek, Mass Effect, The Expanse, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, all while sharing recipes for smart cocktails named for said franchises. It's a fun show, and it's a show that I was on recently. I joined Connor to talk about artificial intelligence in the Star Trek universe for an episode named Data on Trial, and I had a lot of fun. I recommend that you check it out. I'll leave a link to that episode in the show notes. As for today's episode of this show, however, our dive into the proposed inner workings of Federation society continues. The government of the Federation, as we see it on screen, runs pretty smoothly. After all, we never hear about anti-government riots, or scandals involving Federation representatives, or a problem counting the ballots for the Federation presidential election. But to be honest, most of that is because we know almost nothing about the Federation government, and it's understandable. On Earth, we've had 5,000 years of recorded history to learn from humanity's mistakes in governance, and we still can't get a healthcare plan through. So it's no wonder that the very human writers of Trek have nothing to show us about how the United Federation of Planets works. So why not wildly speculate? Connor has a degree in political science, and he and I sat down to have a real talk about what the Federation government might actually look like in the 24th century, how they operate, how it's organized, what responsibilities and rights it provides for its many citizens. I'm not saying that we discovered all the answers, but we came across some pretty intriguing revelations along the way, and that conversation is coming up right now. That's it for me. I'll turn it over to Connor and me. Check us out on social media at EISTpod and watch our live panel from Convergence. What's so funny about peace, order, and good government? And with that, let's get underway. My guest on the show today is Connor Speak. Connor is the host of Rocketman Explores on the Two Finger Guns Club network. Connor, welcome to the show.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you back on, and it's a great time to be a Star Trek fan because there is more Star Trek on TV or streaming than there's ever been, and even more in the works. Have you been watching some of the new shows?
Yeah, I only recently started Discovery, so I'm like most of the way through the first season of Discovery. I got most of the way through the first season of Picard. I haven't quite finished it off yet, but yeah, I've been watching them for sure.
Yeah, well, as somebody who has just started watching Discovery and then started watching Picard, have you found that I guess have you noticed that there's very little crosstalk? You know, it's not like you need to have seen Discovery to really understand Picard. I think that's a
no,
good
not at all.
strategy.
Yeah, no, not at all. They're two completely separate stories. One really has no bearing on the other. Discovery, you don't really need to have seen anything. I mean, Picard, while I'm sure you could jump into it blind, if you haven't seen TNG, the whole sort of basis of the show was kind of pointless. So that,
yeah,
I mean, I'm sure there's a few lunatics who are watching it without having seen TNG. God knows what they think of it.
When you think about, I don't know what the exact audience is for Picard, but like when you think about where TNG and Star Trek was at that time, being a syndicated show, but also being something that I think everybody watched, like people that who wouldn't consider themselves Trekkies watched it. It was just like prime time watching.
It certainly seems that way. Like really, TNG got into the zeitgeist in a way that even that the original series never did, for instance.
Yeah.
Like I know I grew up watching it because my parents watched it. Like one of the first shows I can remember ever watching on TV was watching Star Trek when I was like 3 with my parents.
Yeah. people know Picard, and they probably know that he got turned into a robot at some point,
Yeah.
and that's really all you need to like jump into Picard.
And maybe you should know a bit about that. He had a buddy named Data who is an android, and
Yeah. Oh,
once
people
you
know
know that,
Yeah.
once you know that, you're good to go.
Yeah, for sure. I'm particularly excited for Star Trek Prodigy. I'm looking forward to seeing Captain Janeway or a version of her on screen again. And I'm really warming to the presence of a non-Starfleet crew of young explorers discovering the universe. And the animation looks really great, too.
Yeah, I'm super down.
Yeah. I do hope, though, that the new series, in all their forms, can keep innovating on the Star Trek formula. I know it's always tricky, like we just talked about, trying to bring in people who weren't Trekkies necessarily. And if you're bringing something back that a lot of people liked in a certain form, and you're also trying to catch new viewers with what's worked before, it can be scary to continue to evolve the premise, in the setting of a franchise. But I want to see them push the boundaries even more of what Trek looks like, and not try to just keep doing Star Trek, as
It's
we know
it's a difficult needle to thread, that one in particular, because the hardcore Star Trek fans are known as some of the more, to use the more delicate term, bananas fans there are. You change you change the technical readout of a warp core and someone tries to burn down your house. So
right.
There's a give and take that's necessary there. I mean, but yeah, I'm with you on that. I want to see how far they can push it. I want to see where they can take it. It's the sort of the trilogy or the movies with Chris Pine, in a way, almost disappointed me there, because the first one was great in very clearly setting up, okay, this world can be completely different. There's going to be completely new things. We've set up a timeline that's going to function different. Okay, great, fantastic. And then the second movie, they're like, yeah, but then what if we just redid Wrath of Khan? It's like, no, guys,
guys, wait a minute. No,
don't spend the whole first movie setting up you're going to be different and then remake the second movie.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. So
that's the other side of that coin, trying to draw people in. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's frustrating. But I mean, they are, I think, for the most part, navigating that pretty well with some of the new shows.
Yes.
Although I think they're already running into the problem of wanting to do one thing with Discovery, but having people trying to push them back into, give us the Trek.
Yeah, exactly. It's I mean, at a certain point, I think that any of the creators of these shows just have to sort of put the cotton in their ears and be like, nah, you know what? We're going to do what we want to do, and you can all shout at us over the internet as much as you want. But if you're ever going to evolve the format more than it is, we've got to just push forward with it.
Yeah. We're going to talk about government in Star Trek today, and of course the Federation. And I was reading an anecdote about how when they were putting together Enterprise, or some of the storylines in Enterprise, Brandon Braga called Mike Sussman, who was a writer and producer on Voyager and Enterprise, and asked him, hey, who are the founding species for the Federation again? And Mike Sussman, I don't know, I'm imagining he's being woken up at 2 a.m. in the morning, is like, oh boy, I better tell him something, otherwise he'll go off and create a bunch of new races and piss everybody off. So he just said, oh, the humans, the Vulcans, the Andorians, and the Tellarites, which is, that's basically it. But yeah, even then they're still thinking, we can't piss these people off.
Yeah, exactly.
I like my house
in the back of the mind.
I don't want it burned down. Yeah. Well, your podcast, Rocketman Explores, sometimes touches on Star Trek, but just as much, it's looking at older other sci-fi franchises and works. What does the Rocketman explore on the show?
Well, this particular season, we are exploring artificial intelligence. And in particular, sort of various sci-fi mediums takes on artificial intelligence, including this season, we're sort of expanding outward a bit. I've brought in video games.
Cool.
Well, it's 30 years ago, you wouldn't have been able to do that. But you take the story of something like the game that we examined as Mass Effect, and you'd be hard pressed to find less writing in that story than you would in 5 seasons of a particular television show. So it just didn't make sense to leave them out. Just various, we go after some of the classics. 2001 and Hal is there, and how Hal is really, Hal is viewed as an antagonist, but he's not. He's a tragic figure, sort of operating within the boundaries of where he's been placed, and things like that. So all artificial intelligence, which obviously Star Trek features in not a great deal. It's surprising how little artificial intelligence there is, but data obviously plays a big part.
Yeah. I've struggled with that question myself on this show, why they have never really explored that. so much other than a character, like Data. And
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. The only thing I can think of is that they just wanted to keep the focus on the human characters because
Yeah.
ultimately it's a story about human people. But I think that how humans treat their creations, literally their children, but also their figurative children, is an important question. And they did try to touch on that, of course, in the recent Picard series.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but feel there's also a certain amount of like logistics behind that decision not to touch on it, insofar as that AI, like any AI race, but maybe now they can probably get to it more, as you say, with Picard and such, just due to budgetary reasons. But like,
Yeah.
it's hard to do. It's hard to conceptualize an AI race at the best of times, and when you're doing like a syndicated TV show, that's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I like too that you talk about shows like Farscape because for a
Yeah.
guy that's got 2 Star Trek podcasts, that's one of my favorite sci-fi shows.
Because Farscape is yeah, let me gush effusively about Farscape for a minute, because Farscape is amazing for so many reasons.
Yeah.
Not least because, at least for myself, is any television like show that has Jim Henson puppets in it is automatically going to have multiple points from me. And
Yeah.
as a result, they're able to make their aliens really alien, because they go much more bananas with it, because their aliens are puppets. They're not all dudes in suits. Two of the main characters, one's like a little sort of fat gremlin, the other one is a gigantic like stationary dude with 8 tentacles. And no sci-fi show gets weirder than Farscape. There's an entire episode that takes place in one of our main characters' minds when he goes insane, and it's sort of a Wile E. Coyote style cartoon attempt. There's a ton of weird sex. It's a very strange show. I love it. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's got it like most good things that weren't appreciated in their time. Its legend has grown over the years.
Yeah.
And every now and then, Henson or one of the stars talks about maybe we could do something, and I would love to see, with everything getting a green light with all the streaming shows these days, I'd love to see some kind of return to Farscape.
You'd think, right? Like it seems as though there's now a limitless like space for television nowadays. Every time you turn around, there's a new streaming service with 5 shows. You're like, where did that even come from? So surely there's space for it somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I would hope so. Let's get into our subject for what we're talking about today. And we're talking about the Federation. The Federation is the heart of the Star Trek franchise. In nearly every iteration of Trek, the Federation serves as the foundation of our characters' worlds, and it embodies these egalitarian, these democratic ideals that our characters are fighting for. And there's just one problem with that. We know essentially nothing else about the United Federation of Planets. We don't know the structure of its government. We don't explicitly know the rights and freedoms it guarantees to its citizens. We don't know its economic policies, its criminal justice system, you name it. And we know there's a president, but, we don't know if there's a vice president or a Congress or a parliament or what. So I thought that today we could try to pull the veil back a little bit, open up the black box, or if necessary, wildly speculate on how the Federation government might actually work. And as a poli-sci guy, I figured you'd be the one to ask.
I will do my best. I mean, you're right. And in particular, it's important to note that, because it's not often, but it's very easy to mistake Starfleet for the Federation, but they are 2 separate things, which is weird for a number of reasons, because Starfleet is a separate entity from the Federation. The Federation is like the governing body of the Federation, but Starfleet is technically its sort of military exploration arm. But for instance, there's many episodes in TNG where Picard is acting as a direct ambassador. He's not acting in a military capacity. He's acting as an ambassador for the Federation, which normally would be fulfilled as a government role, but he's fulfilling that as a Starfleet captain. So anyways, that's just but the important distinction is that Starfleet is not technically the Federation, part of the Federation governing body.
Yeah, it's a government
It's an
agency.
It's a government agency.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose if Neil Armstrong ran into aliens on the moon, he would become the representative of America and by proxy Earth. But yeah, Captain Picard has a commission and a mandate.
Yeah,
Starfleet.
That's true. But it wasn't his primary. It's not his. They didn't
right.
send him to the moon to do that, right?
Talk to the moon men. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it would have been great if they did. Been like, backup plan Z5 just on the off chance. Like, here you go, Neil. That would have been fantastic. But
Neil's ready to go. That's a really great point about the military in Trek. And I think that starting off, we need to be realistic about the difference between what liberal fans or leftist ones, and I count myself among the latter, what we want the Federation to be and what we actually see on screen. I'd love for it to be fully automated luxury gay space communism, but in reality, this show was forged in the fires of Camelot, that is the American liberalism of the 60s, and it was renewed during the 80s, the decade of Reaganomics and crass consumerism. So I don't think that book in Picard's Ready Room is the collected works of V.I. Lenin, at least not in the minds of the writers of Trek.
No, definitely not. I mean, it very clearly, the whatever impetus led to the foundation of the Federation, it definitely was not... I mean, you sort of see it originally. It's unclear what the world government, what the human world government looked like when the Federation was founded. It was a world government, but there's nothing that's stated beyond that.
Yeah, that's true. We don't get an idea of its economy or other than it being a quote unquote one world government. We don't know.
And that it was sort of recovering from. It's a post-World War IV, I think, economy, right?
I think it was World War III.
War III,
Yeah, I would love for the Federation or even that Earth government to be a loose anarchistic commune, but I think it's clear that there's an overabundance of political structure and bureaucracy in Star Trek. Yeah,
there's a lot. There are clearly a lot. There's a lot going on with the Federation. There are a lot of, although we don't see it very much, there's clearly a lot that has been laid out by it. So we know it has a president.
Yes.
We don't know how the president is selected. We also don't know sort of what I guess what you have to figure out is, so if there's a president and an executive branch, almost certainly one would think there would be, but is there a judicial branch? So here we get to the first thing, because the idea is that of the Federation is that there are still multiple sovereignties within it, that Earth and the human planets and the Vulcan High Command and the Andorrans and such are all various sovereignties within it. So the very first question is then, does you would think that, of course, the Federation would have a legislative branch, but does it? Because within all the various they're declared as sovereignties, supposedly, that make all their own decision making. So how is that applied in the overarching way of the Federation, I guess, is the first question you really have to ask.
Yeah, and if you look at Memory Alpha, which is not a canon document, but it's what we've got, Memory Alpha states that, quote, the United Federation of Planets was a supranational interstellar union of multiple planetary nation-states that operated semi-autonomously under a single central government. It's founded on the principles of liberty, equality, peace, justice, and progress with the purpose of furthering the universal rights of all sentient life. Yep. And it also says that Federation members exchange knowledge and resources to facilitate peaceful cooperation, scientific development, space exploration, and mutual defense. And it goes on to say that the Federation, and this is, once again, they never say this on screen, so this is the assumption of the chronicler here, but they say that the Federation is a federal constitutional republic. It has a council, a president, and a judiciary headed by a Federation Supreme Court.
Yep.
So that sounds like Space America.
Yeah.
With the member worlds being states or nation states, you know, we're looking at liberal democracy or social democracy.
Yeah. Now, so that's a question. So member worlds, yeah, exactly. Liberal democracy or social democracy. So what is the division of? That becomes another question. Is the division of their presumably then of the cabinet or of their legislative body? Do they divide it by one member per race? Do they divide it by planet? But how do you make that equal? If you have one member of the Federation who has like 2 colonies, then you have the humans, which presumably have hundreds of them. Then obviously that. So then do you divide it just one representative per race?
Yeah.
And make that? But then I guess that would be probably, in my mind, that's the way you would do it, is you have one, but that of course makes the assumption that every single race and sovereignty within it is all governed by their own single governments, that the Vulcans have one government, the humans have one government, the Andorans have one government. Surely there must be at least a couple of races within the Federation that are not unified to that degree, that still have multiple different governments within them. So how do they select their then delegate to the Federation?
That's a good question. Do they have to conform to that? I think the understanding is that generally the Federation, and we don't know about the early days, but the current operation of the Federation in the 24th century is that they generally don't allow worlds to apply for membership unless they have a unified government.
Yes.
I mean, obviously you can't let, they've got a war raging, we can't let that come in. But so, yeah, if that's true, then they have a one government. But like you said, is that a representative democracy, or is it a benevolent dictatorship, or is it total anarchy? Like, we don't know. But whatever it is, everybody has to nominate somebody to go to the unicameral legislative body, which is on Earth.
And then the bigger question is, are there then politics within that legislative body? How is that
Are there parties? Yeah.
Yeah. Are there political parties within that?
Yeah.
One would think, because if there's not, what is it that they're even discussing per se? I guess they can always be in agreement with everything, but that doesn't seem likely.
Yeah. Well, to that end, to parties and interests, I think we need to settle on an economy. I mean, the economy of the Federation, it might be a topic outside the scope of this discussion.
But politics and the economy are always intertwined. It's inescapable.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah. And so, I have my doubts, but I think that we can assume, the franchise makes clear that there's no money. Citizens are provided for from near limitless government services and resources, and that property is mainly personal. And that's the dream. And I think that it's funny that that's definitely not what Gene Roddenberry had in mind when he created Star Trek.
No,
but that's what it's become.
Also, that's insane. Okay,
yeah.
So there's no money in their economy. Okay, that's fine. That's great, as long as you function completely isolated within your own economy. But how do you deal?
How do you trade at all?
How do you trade at all?
Yeah,
what kind of trade system can you have if you have no monetary policy whatsoever? That doesn't make any sense. What can people only from the Federation only ever take leave within the Federation? Because if they try and go anywhere else, they're essentially penniless. How does that translate?
And is it responsible for, let's say that you can just then replicate, 500 space bucks or something to go to another society? How does that, unbalance that society's economy?
Correct,
just
exactly.
Basically contributing to their inflation. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, I think that's why we have to sort of assume that, we're already, in Cloud Cuckoo land here. So if you have to also be in Cloud Cuckoo land if you want to join the Federation. Or maybe the Federation buys you out. I don't know. Maybe you have debts or something, or they just make everybody whole in your world economy and then you can come in.
Or what you do is you create there's a sci-fi series that it's all audiobook. I'm not sure if it's written or not, called, for lack of not a term for each individual book, but it's called the Bobiverse. And it's the idea is that there's a series of, and it's a story of Bob, which is not an artificial, but he's a patterned intelligence, a human mind that's been patterned into a machine, put into a von Neumann probe, and then sent off into space. And he starts self-replicating. It's basically his story and the story of sort of the society that grows up around that after Earth gets destroyed and what happens amongst them. And the economy that human beings end up settling on is all manufacturing becomes based upon gigantic 3D printers. You can 3D print anything. And so economic units become hours of access to 3D printers and hours of access to factories. So it's not money per se, it's access to production. And that makes more sense in a limitless society per se, because you still presumably, even replicators are able to replicate simple things, but you never see them replicate like complex machinery or something. There are still shipyards and such.
Yeah.
So presumably there's still production. It would make more sense to base your economy around that, around the idea of like time spent in production or creation, or energy spent in production or creation, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's something you could do. So you could still claim you don't have money while still having an operational economic system.
Yeah. And like, you know, who owns the 3D printers, or in this case, the replicators? I think that is a question that goes beyond the scope of what Trek has tried to say. But I think the structure that we see on the show tells us that it is definitely owned by the powers that be, you know, the government, the structure.
Yeah, for sure. Starfleet, and by extension, the Federation 100% own all of that.
So and the people own it by proxy, but they don't actually have like access to it. So that's communism knocked out right there.
Yeah, precisely. So no space Marxists, alas. But
but you're right that the economy definitely influences like the way the government is structured. You know, as we're becoming more aware in the 21st century. Speaking personally, you know, for myself, the founding fathers of America in the 18th century were bringing forth onto this continent a new nation where all men were equal, but they did mean men, and who qualified as a man was up for debate. And so we can't forget that, you know, the very real economic concerns that prompted the American Revolution and continued to cause, you know, many revolutions in the years after 1776 were in play. And so, you know, as we said before,
of course, I mean, your entire country was founded on the principle of, I mean, they threw in a bunch of stuff about like, all men are created equal, great, but their problem was taxation. That was it was economy 101. It was they're charging us money for shit that we don't want to be charged for. Done. There you go. You know, like at the end of the day, that's what it really boiled down to.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, in physics, you know, there's a joke in physics where a physicist is going to do an equation, or is going to explain a system, and everything in the system has to be frictionless and spherical, you know, in order to make it make sense. And it's almost the same thing. Like the United Earth government that signed that Federation Charter in 2161 must have already achieved that equality among its citizens and that stable, moneyless economy. I'm sure in practice, and maybe it's in a book somewhere, or we'll see it in the future, they sort of evolve into that. It sure seems like Archer's paying for his drinks in Enterprise, but we almost have to just assume, nope, it's already spherical, it's already ready to go. The same thing with the Andorians and the Vulcans and the Tellarites as well.
Right. Yeah. And they all came to more or less the same decision of what that was supposed to be.
Yeah. And it doesn't look like that if you watch Enterprise.
No, it doesn't.
Tellarites, they have wallets for sure. So, anyway, those economic concerns, of course, would influence in a normal society the way that the government works. Without that, in the Federation economy, you could imagine that representative democracy would be free from influence by special interests and industry, which would be a good thing. I'm sure there's going to be something like somebody, you know, hey, let me open my Cajun restaurant. I'll give you all the crawdads you can eat if you vote for this. Yeah. But hopefully that's at a minimum. But I'm wondering, however, if elected legislators would be necessary at all, if technology would allow citizens to participate in democracy directly, at least on a planetary scale.
That's the other question, isn't it? Like, and also, what is it that you elect your legislators to do? If you've eliminated all those issues already, most of what we elect our legislators to do is to attend to those kind of issues. If they've already been, you know, or to interpret social issues as far as the the majority or the plurality of the citizens of that country want them to be. Presumably, as we see with the Federation has already made all those decisions. They're done with that. So they don't need that. Presumably, you're not electing like your local sort of, you know, they're not electing people to deal with healthcare funding or education funding. Again, this has all been taken care of. So I think that's an excellent question. What is it exactly that you would elect them to do?
I suppose represent the specific interests of that planet or world. You know, if they're going to build a hyperspace bypass that's going to help a lot of Federation citizens, but it's going to make, you know, the value of your property go down.
If they're going to have to bulldoze Earth to make the hyperspace bypass, then that's a bit of, it would be which would lead me to think that maybe there wouldn't be political parties per se, so much as occasionally perhaps several different planets would join together if there's an interest that would affect all of them. But political parties in such a system don't really have a necessity of existence.
Yeah, unless there was, I don't know, maybe it would be relegated to social movements or issues. We see, it's funny, we see
But
in that
the social movements or issues you think would be sort of limited to within the particular sovereignties within the Federation itself, as long as they followed the baseline of what the Federation wants them to do, of no violation of sentient rights, etc., etc.
That's true. That's true. But we see in the DS9 episode, what is it called again? Let He Use Without Sin. There's the, I don't know what to call them, like the decency movement or something like. It's the anti-sex people. Like they're on Risa and they're like,
oh yeah, yeah,
we got to bring the old school Federation values back.
And they turn Worf. They get Worf to join because Worf, for some reason, in DS9 is an intolerable asshole.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And they start messing with the weather machine. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there could be, I don't know, like maybe more conservative planets in the Federation would find themselves joined in a league where they want to push, the tenets of society one way or the other. And it wouldn't affect anything in terms of the economy or anything political, but they are trying to pass, I don't know, you could have to wear a hat on Friday or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's entirely possible. But I feel that it would be more like how we see it in the show, where it's not an official. It seems unlikely the entire planet would suddenly make that decision. It would be more movements, possibly like pan-species between different groups. It would be movements outside of the general, like sort of governmental operation of the Federation, and something more, as you say, like the decency league there.
That's kind of the dirty secret here, is like none of this works without monoculture, and the Federation is like the ultimate expression of like galactic monoculture.
Well, and a lot of, to be fair to the writers there, they deal a lot of the sort of, whenever someone's considering joining the Federation, or a lot of the opposition to the Federation does come down to that.
Yeah,
does come down to people's opposition to monoculture and other empires' opposition, like the opposition to the Federation that isn't explicitly hostile, like the Dominion or the Borg, or to a lesser extent the Klingons, is usually because of their rejection of the Federation's idea of monoculture.
Yeah. Or like specifically something like the Maquis, who have become belligerent in opposition to a decision that the Federation government made with another government,
which they disagree with.
Yeah. On Memory Alpha, it says that as far as the legislative body, the Federation Council goes, member worlds were left to manage their own governance in accordance with their own traditions and local laws, so long as the general requirements of membership were met. And that's similar how to member states of the European Union are bound today. So is the Federation the EU?
It certainly, if you're going to take a modern world example and apply it to that, I think the EU probably makes the most sense.
Yeah.
It's in terms of its hands-off approach to more things, and how it functions as a union of various sovereignties makes the most sense. The EU functions much like the Federation. There are no borders per se. They're all, not all of them. Obviously, the tension between the West and the East is still there and isn't going to go away anytime soon. Wow. But they're starting to blend monoculture to a certain extent. You go anywhere, at least in Western Europe, every menu is in 6 languages. Everyone speaks at least 3 languages. Sure. Like there's so it's probably more applicable than either of our countries, than either of Canada or the States, since both our provinces and you guys as states are still more intertwined with the federal government than perhaps the initial idea of the Federation itself is.
Yeah.
Although then again, the difference, the EU doesn't have an EU army. It still has their own individual armies, whereas the Federation has clearly exported that into itself. Although, has it? Because you still get a lot of Vulcan ships that they only, for instance, the Vulcans have their own Star Academy, which is separate from Starfleet. And in fact, Spock joining Starfleet is this whole big thing. Yeah. So is that even a thing? That's a different question entirely.
Yeah, it is. And of course, we are just following the Starfleet military characters. And so we're not necessarily seeing what's going on with the Vulcan ships or what have you. Yeah. Going back to like the idea of the president and the executive, It seems like I feel like the president, as we see that figure in Star Trek, would be almost completely superfluous in this universe, and yet we've got an elected president that he's the head of, or he or she is the head of both state and government, and is a chief executor, is the supreme commander of the military forces. I mean, it's essentially just the American president, just with a rubber mask on or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you would need them to do.
Yeah, yeah.
Per se. I mean, aside from, I guess, functioning in a high level diplomatic role, you need somebody to do that. And I guess a president is as good a person as anybody else to do so.
And yeah, that's interesting. And being from one of 150 member worlds, I mean, maybe it really is an office of ceremony and just somebody who is there to be the face of it and to embody the ideals
and
of the
it's
Federation.
probably important to the Federation that whoever the president is rotates between member species quite often.
Yeah.
And so it becomes the literal face embodiment of the Federation in that way. In that, unlike, the Emperor or Gowron or whoever, you've got the president is always changing, but that's not the point. The point isn't the individual president. It's the ever-changing nature of the president himself, much like sort of the embracing web of the Federation, if you will. And they're very much like a ceremony, not ceremonial, but a sort of almost a figurehead, like a figurehead in the most literal attempt of the word, the artistic rendering of what the Federation is supposed to be.
Yeah, that's a good expression of it. It's just funny though, because in the American system, at least, the amount of capital and the amount of ambition it takes to become president just seems like that would just not fit at all into the world of Star Trek. I mean, obviously you would have people who, well, we have to assume the fictional technology of complete benevolence in this universe, but like would not necessarily want to hold power or control over other people. But you'd have to put so much into it. And if we're assuming a representative democracy here, like how is this person voted for? Does everybody get on their phones, or do the planets vote like individually?
Exactly. Do they? I mean, presumably, I think it would probably be something. It's a good question. I say probably not every member of every planet. If anything, I'd say you give the votes to the particular representatives.
Yeah.
And they sort of choose, maybe slightly like the Canadian system, in that the prime minister is merely the one decided by their party,
just
or in this
elevated
case, elevated by the party, but is just a member of parliament, the same as everybody else. And in fact, if you wanted to have a rotating basis through all the species, that would probably be the best way to do it. Is every couple of years you elevate another like representative of one of the heads of species. All the other sort of representatives have to vote in order, like have to agree on that. So they'd have to vote in order for that to be the case.
Yeah.
And there you go. You choose them. You just keep popping them up from within this particular, so they're always somewhat elected insofar as it's always going to be the elected representative from whatever planet they came from, and then within that framework they are then chosen from amongst all the possible delegates.
Yeah, it's just that the idea of that charismatic figure, just in terms of like the American president, like it just seems antithetical to what they're doing. Because like we already asked if there's political parties, like who are they like representing if it isn't a member
if
of
it
world?
Isn't, yeah. Precisely. So
and there's no economic you couldn't find economic backing or any like party considerations.
No,
so would you like collect signatures or something like that? Like I've got 100 million signatures, so I'm going to put myself in the ballot. How would you even run?
Yeah, I think it's the one thing where it probably diverges heavily from the states, so that it just wouldn't make sense. It's probably that's why I think it's probably more of just they probably just swap them out every now and then, and there you go. It's another duty that every representative at some point may have to perform, is just to perform the duties of president. And then you come in and out. You may, you have a fixed term of a couple of years. You get selected. You probably then can't do it again. Passes to someone else. There you go. If there's no benefit behind it, then there's also like no big battle to be it, and so you could swap it around relatively easily.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, you don't have people desperate for pardons because of all the possible crimes they've committed trying to become president.
Yeah.
You know, like who? No, not to mention any names, but you know, that's an unlikely thing to occur here.
Yeah. Yeah, Michael Burnham lucked out that her second cousin was the,
yeah,
the president.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're not really talking about like local government. We're sticking kind of to federal here, but maybe in this case, there would be a system of demarchy where you would have like, as you suggested, maybe somebody's just randomly selected to be the president. Like it's this member world's turn, because really they're only putting their hand, on the till, and it's not like they're driving at some particular ideology or something like that.
Again, very similar to how the EU does it, in that it's a rotating presidency of the EU.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that would work. I think we should look into that. Speaking, as we were, of bureaucracy, here's some of the executive agencies maintained by the Federation. There's Starfleet, of course.
Yep.
There's the Central Bureau of Penology, the Department of Cartography, the Archaeology Council, the Federation Astronomical Committee, the Bureau of Industrialization, the Bureau of Planetary Treaties, the Federation Food and Drug Administration, the Federation News Network. Uh-oh, that sounds bad.
Yeah, there you go.
The Science Bureau, the Science Council, and Terraform Command, and that which should not be named, Section 31, of course.
Yeah. Otherwise known as all a gigantic bunch of nerds. Like listen to all of those things. There's 3 different set of science councils. There's multiple. Yes. It's great. It's fantastic.
Yes. Yeah. And I wonder how much power each of these agencies has, or how much the extent of their influence goes, because like you said, why not one science thing? Why a bureau and a council? Why the archaeology, astronomy, cartography?
Well, no, to a certain extent that makes sense. You have the Bureau of so let's get into some serious theory crafting here. You have the bureau and you have the council. So you have 2 different things. The bureau may be the practical application of science, and of let's say you have the Scientific Council, which is dealing with funding for like far out future projects, for pie in the sky projects, things like in the episode that we discussed on my show, the creation of more datas, for instance, and things like that. And then you have a bureau, as we've seen in our society, unlimited technological growth without us really knowing what's going to happen to it can completely fuck you up. The internet has turned our entire planet on its head, and none of us really know what to do with it. So surely then you would want a scientific bureau to deal with the implementation of all these things that are being created. Mm-hmm. So you have the practical, and then in terms of science, you have the practical, and then you have the pie in the sky, like speculative and research.
Right. And then they report to a cabinet member or a minister or something that makes
just all of them. You do have, you might do it similarly to, again, because I know this system the better, to how cabinets are made in the Canadian system, where it's the same thing. Again, it's all just various members of parliament that are assigned cabinet positions. They then form their own plenary committees and such within that, and it again all just rotates. Now, obviously, you then have to have experts in the field to sort of back that up. It's pointless to have some idiot in charge of who's never farmed a thing in his life in charge of the agriculture thing, and have no one else going there. So you have all your expertise, but then the government influence of that may just again be a rotating body that sort of rotates through those various portfolios.
Yeah. Trek, in a lot of ways, throughout its existence, has been an expression of the desires of society at the time.
Yeah.
In the 60s, it represented a world where all these problems with race, weren't a thing, and we weren't going into Vietnam, and
there's no Cold War, and
yeah, exactly, yeah. And so, I wonder about the idea of having a series of ministries and a prime minister or a president, and they're all sort of selecting each other and organizing themselves. I think a lot of people feel powerless right now, that we have no control, or say in our government. That I wonder if they were going to represent, if they're going to do a government show, like a Star Trek show about government and democracy, if we would see each one of those ministers being decided on. It's totally impractical by the populace, because already what you're describing that just sounds like the bureaucracy to me, which maybe is necessary, for a government of trillions of people. But I think that people would want to have a direct say in what happens in government. Or many people might just say, you know what, I don't really care all that much.
Maybe not. I mean, this is, you see, I find what you said, I find that very interesting, because this, I feel, is almost a bit of this is a demonstrative division between an American view and a Canadian view right here. Because, and what I mean by that is, as you said, you're like, the people would want to know what's going on in their government. Okay, fine. But my position, and at least the position a lot of people here, is that as long as the government is doing what it's supposed to do, and it's not doing something outlandish and crazy, which it doesn't, then no, let them get on with it. Why the fuck should I make every single decision the government makes? What is the point of having them there if I'm supposed to then choose everything that they ever fucking do? That's crazy. That's, as long as they operate within the guidelines that have been set and the guidelines that they promise that they're going to operate within, which they don't always do, but almost all the time they do. Then I guess it comes down to the mottos of governance. The motto of the American government, as you know, is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? The motto of the Canadian government is peace, order, and good governance. And it's very much, that's the differentiation right there. Is life and liberty come out, the idea being the life and liberty come out of good governance. Something like a government shutdown or having to vote on like every dog catcher and such is anathema, because I don't actually care to have that much influence within the operation of government. And if you then extenuate that to trillions of people, I don't necessarily know if everyone would be like, I actually want to make all those decisions for that. I don't.
There would be government groupies like vote spotters
for sure. But as long as they're operating within like the boundaries that you initially set for them, and the idea, like how you want them to go, it doesn't really matter their specific decision makings that they do or who does what.
How does Federation C-SPAN work? Yeah, I mean, if we're assuming again that there is a heightened level of benevolence and personal responsibility,
which again we have to, or
we kind of have to.
We have to, or the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah. But I mean, just like, from, the view of 2021, it's like, we can't even get our police defunded, like where I live. It's, that fantasy of having some kind of say where somebody listens to you is attractive to me as a viewer.
Of course. But then again, that I feel is more a byproduct of having a government that isn't functioning within the parameters that the vast majority of people have set for it.
Yeah.
Therein lies the problem. Everyone wants the specific say in there because your government is not functioning in the way that the majority of people want it to. So that in itself is anathema to how the Federation would or is supposed to function.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about like law and order. Let's talk about the judiciary side of the government.
That's an interesting one.
Yeah, and it's an open blank sheet of paper because it is mentioned that there's a Supreme Court.
Yep.
I don't know if we ever see the inside of a civilian courtroom. We see courts martial, of course.
Yep.
But I think we can assume that there are still civilian courts, jury trials, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. That would, of course. We can assume, I would think, that there's still laws and that people still do break them.
Yeah, and then what happens? What happens?
Well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
But I mean, you never hear of a Federation jail.
No, you hear of like penal colonies and things like that.
You do hear penal colonies. So probably, something similar. You go to a penal colony.
I can't remember if it's explicit, but like when Julian's father confesses to having genetically modified him, which was illegal, he does have to report for something, not re-education, but he has to report for some kind of for punishment. And I don't know if I just imagine that they would, just put him to work somewhere. But yeah, I mean, like it doesn't, and it's weird because
that's an interesting punishment in a society where supposedly they have eliminated all like money and such. And so everyone works anyways for the benefit of society,
Yeah,
how
right.
is it therefore a punishment to put somebody to work
It's
for
something
the
he doesn't want
benefit
to
of
do.
society? Yeah, precisely. But then that in and of itself is inefficient, because if you're making the person do what they don't want to do, they're not going to
Yeah,
anyway.
right. And they were supposed to be benevolent and anyway,
Yeah,
yeah. So they just vaporize everybody.
yeah. There you
Well,
go.
I hate to like we often do in real life, just leave the judiciary to take care of itself. But I guess I don't really know what else to say about it. But maybe it'll come out in this next part where I want to talk about. I want to move on from structure and talk
Yep.
about the things that we expect the government to do for us or to have the power to do. And
Okay.
we've kind of touched on this already, but obviously setting economic policy is
Is a big
a
one.
role of the government. Yeah.
Yep.
And so, we talked before about the unequal yoking between the moneyless Federation economy and whoever it is that they decide to deal with. For
Mm-hmm.
instance, I can't imagine that when the Federation swoops in to help rehabilitate Bajor after the Cardassian occupation, that Bajor just doesn't have any money. Like they probably do. They probably
Yeah,
have an economy that's dissimilar to the Federation.
precisely. Yeah, and so what do they do? Do they then set them up and be like, oh, well, no, okay, this is just the better way of doing things, guys?
Yeah.
Because surely that then, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. It's unfortunately, I think that's very much one of those things that's sort of hard to sort of parse exactly how they then figure that one out.
I wonder if, assuming that the Federation's moneyless, economy is stable, I
Yep.
wonder if then economic policy becomes a process of trying to convert or influence other cultures to have the same thing.
Yes.
To give up, capitalism or the pursuit of wealth or whatever it is. There is a book series called the Culture series by the
Mm-hmm.
late author Ian Banks, and at the center of the Culture series is the Culture, which is it's a anarchistic, moneyless Federation type society, and they devote themselves to two things: enjoying themselves and hedonism, but
Mm-hmm.
also subtly applying economic and political pressure on the other races of the galaxy to
Yep.
like chill out and be like them. And that first of all, you have to want to chill out and not actually care about money, which is not, I'm not sure that that's what we see in the Federation, but I wonder if the Federation would try to do that, through their diplomats and through economic programs, try to relieve suffering that they see in other cultures and get them on board.
Certainly it would make sense. And I mean, and they're often accused of that. They're
Yeah,
often
trying to hegemonize. Yeah,
yeah, they're often accused of that by like the Klingons and the Romulans, et cetera, et cetera. That
right.
quite often that part of the reason that they say that, that they state is that the Federation's the viewpoints and how they operate is never as benevolent as they claim, because it's through soft power, not hard power, but they still are attempting to actively mold things towards themselves and how it is that they themselves function.
And, would it be so bad, Romulans and Klingons, if you didn't need, to pay your rent in Quatlus or whatever it is? But of course,
But of course, that
that's
comes
their
down
right.
to yeah, that's the right. That comes down to then the civilizing, colonizing. As you said, the Culture series is a great example of that.
Yeah.
There was a very good point of that. Is that the Klingons would say, well, of course we're Klingon, we're not Federation. Our culture is the culture of the warrior, and the idea that yours is somehow better because of that is inherently like ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. It's racist.
Yeah.
Basically. Yeah. I also wonder about the government's role in protecting rights, especially in a liberal democracy. And, we just talked about the differences between worlds, asking a race that is not us or is outside from us to share our values. There are a number of shared values you're expected to accept if you join the Federation, but then it's anything goes, right, as far as the individual member worlds. So what would the Federation's role then be, both within itself and outside of itself, protecting and policing those rights?
Well, that's so. It brings me back to a very early TNG episode,
Yeah.
where they all go a bit nuts, and Tasha ends up sleeping with Data, of course. And when she talks to him, she describes her earlier life and she said something like, when I was busy hiding from the rape gangs.
Yes.
Now, this is someone who has since joined the Federation, which means A, that the Federation knows about her planet, and B, it's possible. It's possible it is a member of the Federation. I mean, it's a human planet, presumably. So how did a human planet end up not part of the Federation? But then what the is going on there?
I don't know the details, but I know that it's a failed colony.
Yeah.
So, and I'm not sure if the colony was established by human settlers, I'm presuming, in these centuries prior. But I don't know if like colony worlds then, we haven't even talked about this. Do colony worlds like get promoted to being a Federation member world, or must you have a population or an economy or a society of a certain size? But yeah, whatever it was they fell through the cracks. There are cracks in the Federation system.
So clearly, I mean, at least that would seem to imply that the Federation doesn't police exterior places perhaps as much as it should. I mean, it's one thing to not police what the Romulan Empire is doing to its citizens, but if you're just going to let some random ass human colony fall apart and start rape ganging each other, that's taking like non-interference to a kind of insane degree.
I would agree. I think Turkana 4, I think is the name of her planet, and I have no idea how it got there, but I don't know. It's a dereliction of duty of the Federation government.
But so in terms of how they enforce it, I mean, it says, sovereignties wishing to join the Federation, must not employ caste-based discrimination, must not have interesting, says must not employ caste-based discrimination, nothing else. I guess that's sort of within there would include like sexual or anything like that. Sure. Must not have a record of violations of sentient rights. And there we go. And that's it. So they have some kind of I guess, you'd probably want to call it like a constitution of sorts that details various rights. And as long as you follow that, then you're good to go.
Yeah. That experiment with the rape-based economy did not work.
Yeah, exactly. Well. They quickly were like, wait a minute, like surely we've already figured this out. We didn't have to let this experiment continue, but
Well, speaking of economies, one of the duties of a government, or one of the necessities of a government, is raising taxes. And I don't know if that is applicable here. I mean, do Federation member worlds contribute resources? Human resources.
They're certainly looking for resources. There have been several. There have been several episodes involving attempting to get planets with particular resources to join the Federation. There's the entire episode where there are several different representatives that go to this one particular planet, including like the other Betazoid who ends up having this whole like romantic thing with Troy. Yeah. And they're all gunning because these guys have a particularly high amount of like rare minerals. And that's
I think it was a wormhole, wasn't it?
It was the wormhole, yes. No, you're right. It had the presence of the wormhole, but it was also implied, I think like the leader of that particular planet implies that sort of there would be an exchange of resources, including like natural resources and such when they become a member. So taxes in the base form of the world probably wouldn't make sense. But if you're like a mining planet that is particularly like has enormous amounts of lithium on it, you probably do exchange. Maybe tax is the wrong word, but if you're all working towards like the betterment of society as a whole, you clearly don't need all of that. So that is your exchange into the Federation in order to then receive all the various other things that you'll then get from it.
Yeah. Well, that leads
a certain amount of sense.
That leads into my next bullet point, which is distributing resources. Yeah. Which in this case, if you're planet A and you live near planet B and planet B doesn't have any unobtainium, but you've got a ton, are you expected to then, surrender unobtainium to the government, which will then distribute it to planet B?
I suspect yes. I suspect that's probably a large part of what is maintaining that logistical command of getting unobtainium to where it needs to go, where it's I suspect that's a very large part of that. That's probably what we would consider their economic aspect. Well, not taxes per se. It is more sort of communistic, and distribution of resources, I suspect, plays a large part of it.
I think that would suggest the existence of a merchant fleet then, and maybe merchant is literally the wrong word for it, but there has to be a bunch of ships that aren't the Enterprise. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That aren't Starfleet, that
Transport
are just moving
ships.
things.
Well, they run into they run into things they describe as freighters like relatively often. Do they
Sure.
not? Like
Yeah.
so yeah, you would need a freighter fleet. You need transport fleet.
And we were talking about AI before. Like in TOS, they've got like drone, like robot ships that are moving grain and minerals and stuff around, which
yeah.
I would assume in the 24th or the 23rd century would be a lot easier than our, self-driving trucks or whatever today. Like why make poor Cassidy go out there and be a freighter captain for 3 months when you can just have like a robot ship take
Exactly. You literally could just program it, pick up at a drop-off point, go wherever. Presumably you would set up sort of maybe centralized. It would make sense to make a system of stations that were somewhat centralized to a large degree of like various star systems. You could all go to one point and then just head out from there.
Sure. Yeah. Making war, or I guess making defense, taking care of the defense of the Federation is, of course, one part of the government. And this is what we see, with Starfleet. We don't ever, I'm assuming there's a Federation ground or planetary military. We never really get into that in the series.
Yeah.
Starfleet seems to encompass so much of that. It is a military / explorative / diplomatic / scientific organization, which is just that's a lot of things to cover.
It's got its fingers in a lot of pies.
It certainly does. Yeah. And it makes you worry about, the military industrial complex. But I guess if there's no economy, there's no military industrial complex to worry about.
There's no complex to, yeah, exactly. It's all sort of, in fact, if there's no economy, it having its fingers in so many pies does sort of make more it still doesn't make total sense, but does make more sense. It's the Starfleet, instead of we're thinking of it in a military context because that's how we would view a military industrial complex as such. But I think maybe the better view of it is it's the exterior arm of the Federation. The Federation, the president is dealing with the interior. Starfleet deals entirely with the external arm of the Federation, with exploration, with trade, with the military, with
exterior.
It's pretty much the department of the exterior. It's the department of dealing with other civilizations. It's the department of, and sometimes that means including dealing with things militarily, but also explorationally, also diplomatically, all sorts of things like that.
It's not a terrible idea, but of course, this is an action sci-fi show, and so the people that we see and follow have these huge guns and they're flying around everywhere and they're often shooting them. So that part I don't like, but I'd imagine that there would be many, many Starfleet ships who aren't doing that at all. They're literally there just to say hi or to provide resources or whatever.
Yeah, I have an issue with Starfleet's like design philosophy on their ships, and that because they don't seem to have specialization. You're right that you get the Enterprise, which is essentially like a science lab / Marriott in space, flying around shooting things with torpedoes all the time. Which surely you would want two different ships to do that, but that's a whole another story.
Yeah. Another function of government is maintaining law and order. And I wonder if, obviously Starfleet is a part of that. We don't ever really see any cops on the show.
No.
We see the Temporal Protection Bureau in that one DS9 episode, but that's kind of like
that's a very particular kind of cop.
Yeah, right.
Surely there can't be that many people committing time crimes.
Yeah. In the DS9 episode Homefront in Paradise Lost, where the Starfleet tries a military coup, or at least one part of it does, they send people to patrol, the streets of America, at least, and we see them in Starfleet uniforms. So the fact that Starfleet now add another thing, civil defense, to their slashes, like that's a lot for one organization to take care of.
It seems like, at least for that stuff, I got the feeling that they have Starfleet uniforms because the Starfleet members are the only ones with any sort of military training at all, and that's why they're used as such. And that there don't seem to be police per se.
Yeah.
But of course that begs the question: if there's a judiciary and they are like dealing with, as you say, with crime and punishment,
right?
Who's arresting all these criminals?
Just I got a court date.
Are they so honest that they go, I know
I'll be late for jail.
Yeah, I know I did you bad. It's a fair cop. Like, here we go. Like, what are they doing?
Yeah. We do see in Star Trek 2009, we do see that one like robot cop that's going after young James Kirk.
Yes, correct.
The car.
Exactly. But yeah,
that's an alternate universe and a total reimagining of.
But it
of the
is an
whole
interesting question. Of you're right that you never see any police whatsoever.
thing. Yeah,
ever.
I think it's time for Star Trek to tackle that.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's because there's got to be something. Surely there has to be. Well, maybe there isn't, but it begs the question then of if that's the case, then how do you even know anyone's committed a crime or anything like that?
Yeah, well, in Picard, you can just use your little tablet and you can scan the entire crime scene and go, here's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, of course, when you download the Sherlock Holmes app and it just tells you. But
yeah, eyeglasser. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, all this talk of representative government and organization of government, what I want to talk about is anarchy. We think of humans as naturally being social and organizing and making and maintaining structure, especially socially.
Yep.
Everything good in the world flows into the city. But a lot of that is supported by commerce and by industrialization and by social and economic power structure. And if everyone in the Federation can have a replicator and some land somewhere, they've got, 8,000 light years to play in. What's to say that the trend wouldn't be to delocalize, to have people just go live in log cabins and have Jeffersonian agrarianism minus the need to really produce anything, to have, anarchy.
Exterior pressure, because anarchy's all well and good, and then the Borg show up and you're all gone. Unfortunately, there has always been exterior pressure on the Federation. First, it was the Klingons, then it was the Romulans, then later on it's the Borg and such. Anarchy is always a desirable way of life as long as there's no one else who's not doing anarchy next to you. But as soon as there is, then you're fucked. And the Federation has always been in a situation where there has always been an oppositional force set against it. So I suspect that it's just practically, it's never been an option. Even though they would like it to be, from a practical viewpoint, they still need to keep together. They still need Starfleet, just in terms of they coach it in utopian ideals, but it's also a survival strategy as well. It always has been.
I would like that to be true. And these utopian egalitarian ideals that they espouse, I would like to see them explored totally. I hate to think that our utopia is defined by the fact that we're better than they are, or that they're always trying to attack us and we're holding them back, the barbarians at the gate, as it were. But it just seems like even when we make a utopia, we can't not conceptualize it with those forces in play. To go back to the culture real fast, like one of the reasons the culture works so good is because they are just superior to everybody. And even when somebody tries to pick on them, they can just go, okay, fine, we'll just cede territory and spend time building warships because we don't actually normally have warships. And then we can do some gunboat diplomacy after that. But the Federation I think it's just so natural for America to feel like it's been at war for the last 100 years. And it has, to be fair.
It has, yeah.
That we just look at it in those terms. Like, we've got to keep the Romulans out. Why not make overtures to the Romulans? Why not bring the Romulans in? Why not have a good relationship with the Romulans instead of these neutral zones and things like that?
Well, I mean, you're correct. But again, that's always predicated on the assumptions the Romulans want such a thing.
That's true.
Or that the Klingons want such a thing. Certainly, at least, and you're in earlier times, you're right. As soon as you get into situations such as with the Borg, that's clearly never going to be an option.
Well, that's
that becomes a problem. Yeah, but that's sort of a pie in the sky thing. But it's again, the assumption being that the Romulans want such a situation to be the case. They may not. There are still many particular cultures and such that have the idea of utopianism and anarchy may be good, but advancement is always through adversity. For example, the Romulans being modeled sort of more or less off of Rome. Rome would have never viewed
they wouldn't stop expanding.
They wouldn't stop expanding, and they wouldn't view an anarchist utopian society as something that was even worth considering, because it goes against the fundamental, their fundamental idea of what excellence and greatness would be.
Yeah, and the only way to have galactic utopia is to crush them, I guess.
The only way to have galactic utopia is to do what the Federation subtly is trying to do with soft power, is to convince them all that everyone else's ideas are wrong and the Federation's idea is right.
it just keeps receding into the distance.
Yeah.
There have to be people who just drop out of the Federation.
I'm sure there are.
Yeah. I mean, I think the hustle to survive in our own capitalist era has been reframed as a hustle to achieve and for betterment in Trek's future.
Yeah.
But at some point, if you can have like 40 acres and a replicator, you know, people just check out.
Well, Picard's brother, for example. What does Picard's brother do? He chills on his whiner and he drinks wine.
Yeah.
Right? Why not?
Yeah, although he must maintain some kind of status because he has who knows how many, he's got, let's say, 500 acres on Earth in a future where there must be trillions of humans in the universe. So, like, why does he get to live there still?
That's and
maintain that?
It is well, interestingly, I mean, it's suggested that their family has owned land for a very long time.
Sure.
So,
landowners,
which means it goes back to capitalism again. Yeah. So, and round and round and round we go.
Oh, the whole system's broken.
Yeah.
Well, Connor, it's been great talking with you. The time has just flown by. I find this subject fascinating, and I think that
great.
Star Trek has done so much to forward progressive ideals from the perspective of civil rights. I think it's time that it graduates to educating its audience on political structures and taking some stronger stands on how civil rights can inform economic and social policy.
I'm 100% in agreement with you there. It's an obvious evolution. It's an obvious evolution of where they could go if they want to keep pushing the envelope of where it is. If they want to keep moving forward socially, things like that, I agree that it's 100% where they should go. It'd be a great, I would watch that.
Yeah. The West Wing, but like, not like the West Wing.
Yeah, precisely.
Not that way.
The West Wing, but like, better, not the United States.
Yeah, right. Well, where can people find you and Rocketman Explores online?
Well, you can try finding me at home, but I will fight you off, so stay away, you crazy people. But otherwise, no, you can find us, Rocketman Explores, anywhere that you listen to your podcasts. We're on Apple Play, we're on Stitcher, we're all over the place. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Rocketman TFGC. Nice. And please do. That would be fantastic.
It's a really fun show, and if listeners want a jumping on point, maybe they can start with the episode that I appeared on recently.
Correct. That would be a good one.
It's called Data on Trial.
Yeah, and you can already tell. Aaron's much more knowledgeable than I am, so it's a good way. It's a good way to start off.
I have Memory Alpha in my back pocket at all times, but yeah. Well, thanks again for talking with me.
No worries, dude. Anytime. I will gladly sink many more hours discussing the esoterics of Federation government anytime you want.